morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar this morning as part of Patient Experience Week around intersections and our Intersections project. I'd like to acknowledge the many traditional lands from around the country that we're working on today. I'm on Gadigal land, and I pay my respects to the local elders, past, present and emerging, and to all Aboriginal people who are joining us today. I'd also like to welcome and introduce everybody to Dr. Gávi Ansara. Dr. Ansara was our project manager for the Intersections project, and Gávi has a wealth of experience around working with people with intersectional needs, both in his clinical practice, and also Gávi's one of the sort of leading the international experts around intersectionality, and I encourage you to look at any and all of Gávi's research papers on the topic. What we'll do today is I'll hand over to Gávi in a second, who will introduce himself a bit more fully and introduce the project. We'll share one of the animations that the group from the University of Technology in Sydney developed for us, and then we'll dive into the details of the work and our findings. So welcome, Gávi, and thank you. And I'll just get your slides up.
Right. So we're going to tell you a little bit about the project. Definitely encourage people to read the final report that we've put out that's available on the Health Consumers New South Wales website, so that you can get a lot of the rich detail. We've just picked a few snippets for you, but really it doesn't do justice to the full breadth and depth of the project. And I also want, as we're beginning, I also want to thank Julia Bruckhausen, who's here today, because Julia has done a massive amount of work on this project and collaborated with students on a lot of these graphics and imagery that are part of the projects, and the animation that Anthony will play for you. Julia really had a hand in managing this stuff. And so Julia's expertise, Julia's amazing creative insights are a big part of all of this. So I just want to really appreciate Julia, who many, many times over has done so much for me, for the project. She really can't be appreciated enough. And thanks to Anthony for taking on this project. So I want to start by acknowledging Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, South Sea Islander, Māori Pacifica, and Indigenous peoples around the world. We acknowledge their enduring sovereignty over lands, waters, knowledge and kinship systems, and scientific and community wisdom. And I want to acknowledge the first peoples on whose land I live and work, which is the Bunurong people. Not so much the Wurundjeri people in my specific case, although used to be, mainly nowadays the Bunurong people of the Eora Nation. And we also bear witness to the diversity of lived experiences among Aboriginal peoples, because they're not the same, and the resilience and strength in the face of genocide and colonization, as well as the ongoing resistance to present day forms of racism and systemic oppression. And I honor elders and ancestors whose wisdom endures, including any Aboriginal people who might be here today. And I think this map, by the way, is a problematic map in many ways. So on one hand, it's an immediate way of illustrating just how many different peoples there are that lived across the different lands that are called by the colonial name Australia. But it's also a problematic map because it's not intersectional, and it doesn't show the ways that different peoples migrated and moved and coalesced and intersected with each other throughout the land. It's a very static map. So in some ways, this picture, I really like this picture because it really illustrates how even when you're trying to demonstrate diversity and complexity, it's very difficult to visually represent intersectionality. And I think that this map really shows that there's still a lot of work to be done. And that's a big part of this project, this Intersections project. So Anthony is going to share with you an animation that I think really does demonstrate some of the attempts at visual representations of intersectional needs. So when we were doing this, we actually based the different dimensions of people's lived experience with healthcare, with seeking healthcare, and with engaging with healthcare based on these 7 healthcare rights from the Australian Charter of Healthcare Rights. And so that was a useful way for us to frame the different areas that people were speaking to us about. We could identify which of these rights was not being achieved or where people were struggling because of the way that they were being treated across each of these different areas. And so that's how the different comments that we're going to be sharing today fit in with the Australian Charter of Healthcare Rights. And it's a useful hook because it's a way of taking experiences that are quite complex, that are logistically, in some cases, logistical nightmares that people experienced, and really fitting them in with one or more of these 7 domains. Really, these are about people's ability to access services that address their actual healthcare needs, their ability to get services that feel safe to them. That's both physical safety and emotional safety, as well as cultural safety. That is, that the protocols and ways of doing things that work best for them and that are part of their own lived experience communities are part of the health services they receive, part of the way that services are delivered. That the care shows respect for people's lived experiences, the cultures they belong to, their beliefs, their values, and their personal characteristics. And that they have the ability to be, to have information sharing, for there to be information sharing and communication in healthcare context. It's not just a one-way, a professional tells them what to do and they do it, but they're able to feed information in that actually changes the way that the services are delivered. And that they are also in partnership in making decisions and choices about their care, that people's privacy is maintained, and that people have the ability to give feedback. They can comment, they can complain, they can share what their needs are. Again, that really influences how things are done. There's not a one size fits all based on some kind of assumption about who people are and what they need. So there were a few things about the process of how we went about looking at these concerns, these intersecting needs that weren't being addressed. And one of those was to adopt the nothing about us without us approach. Now, nothing about us without us is for us actually is a slogan that originally came from South African disability rights activists. The idea was that there were a lot of people who were speaking about people. They might even have called their approach person-centered, but it was, I'm centering on you from the vantage point of the clinician. The clinician is positioned as the expert, as the knower, as the person whose information is valuable, and I am looking at you from the outside, deciding what's best for you. Whereas part of cultural humility is, and part of this nothing about us without us is for us approach, is the idea that people and communities with a lived experience are the experts on that lived experience. And so without actually finding out directly from people what their needs are, we really won't know. And so even the way that we did this was very flexible so that people were able to tell us throughout. Our process was enacting a lot of those 7 healthcare rights, those principles in the way that we engage with people. We were also trauma informed in the sense that I'm a trauma specialist as a therapist, and I also have lived experience of trauma. And I brought that personal and professional lived experience into the way that we designed this. So I didn't expect people to open up to me in the first meeting. There was a lot of support provided before, during, and after. A lot of the timeframes were really much slower than they often are in typical processes where people will just give someone a questionnaire or they ask them to share what are really emotionally loaded and challenging experiences that are quite painful. They expect people to just do that and then that's it. You sign a waiver and I've done my duty and given you a bunch of resources and move on. But in fact, we actually built personal relationships with, professional relationships that were holding and supportive with each of the people who participated, and offered a lot of follow-up support, so that there were people who took a long time, even months, to share bits and pieces of their experiences with us. We were also person-directed. So how people wanted to meet, the medium that we met in, how long we would meet for each time, the different locations we would meet in, the setup, all of these things were determined by the people. And I really made a point of asking people rather than just saying, here's what you do, and expecting them to object if they had a problem. So it was very much directed by the people we were working with. And we also had contact with not only, we definitely had key informants who were people from communities. So for example, we got a lot of support from people who were running organizations like the Sex Workers Outreach Project. Chantel Martin provided a lot of useful information. And we realized also that if people trusted people, so like Finn Borg at the Gender Center, that we would get more people giving us information if they felt like people who ran organizations that served communities who also had direct lived experience were involved in the process, and could say, yes, we get where these people are coming from, and we can tell you that we can recommend participation because we feel like these people will respect you. That counted for a lot. However, we didn't just engage with leaders. The whole point of this was to not have people representing other people on their own behalf. And so rather than just contacting people running organizations, we have people who are not activists, people who have never been contacted before. We're able to hear about some experiences that are not typically discussed, even when people engage with some of the same lived experience and lived experience communities that we engaged with. So this is just a few of the people. Again, it's worth going on the website and reading or listening to the full narratives, as well as looking at the report. But just a few snippets. So we had MD, whose pronouns are they, them, and theirs. And these were people's self-identifications because we didn't want to label people. Again, nothing about us without us. So MD describes themselves as an intersex and trans Aboriginal person with a chronic illness, chronic pain, and post-traumatic stress response. I'm also a sex worker. Rachel B, her pronouns are she, her, and hers, described herself as an autistic parent who has a 21-month-old child. I also have depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress response, and I'm in a sexually non-monogamous relationship with my partner, and I'm active within Sydney's BDSM kink community. And that got cut off. More people. Leo, whose pronouns are they, them, and theirs, described themselves as a 19-year-old queer agendered person on the autistic spectrum, also struggling with anxiety and depression. Leon, whose pronouns are he, him, and his, described himself as a 41-year-old gay man who is overweight, HIV positive, has extensive interaction with the criminal justice system, and does not fit into the stereotypical gay mold. And Leon said, I have experienced financial deprivation for most of my adult life, combined with housing instability and drug dependency. So in terms of the healthcare right to access, MD described how they were unable to access Aboriginal medical services without documents to prove Aboriginality, But they said, as an Aboriginal intersex person who's also a non-binary trans person, my Aboriginal community refused to give me my papers. This meant that I had to deal with non-Aboriginal services that didn't understand my cultural needs. So you can see there that the intersection of being a non-binary trans person who's also intersex and having to deal with Aboriginal medical services excluding them meant that they had to deal with services that didn't understand one part of them. So that's a useful way of looking at how the failure to address intersectional needs, both by the non-Aboriginal services and by the Aboriginal medical services, contributed to this person, to MD, not having access to services at all. And then Rachel B said, I can't access any NDIS or autism-related services without a formal diagnosis. So again, this issue of not having the right paperwork, but I can't afford the cost. I shouldn't have to spend $1,200 to get an adult diagnosis of autism. And I hear this from a lot of autistic people. And a few of the other autistic people in our study also mentioned, in our outreach project also mentioned this. Leon said, it's the hidden things, bureaucracy that continually causes more and more drama, that continues to discriminate against people and create health access barriers. So part of what this project was useful in identifying and making visible was how different bureaucratic issues intersect with each other for people with intersectional needs in a way that causes barriers that people are not aware of. And that working in silos in separate populations doesn't allow people to capture these kinds of complexities. So this was a particularly useful insight from Leon. And Rachel B said, talking about safety, while distressed, I have to decide how much to disclose to hospital staff. I don't want to out my partner as polyamorous unnecessarily, but I encounter stigma the moment I disclose this vital piece of information, which is often clinically relevant. So you can see there that even when people don't disclose stuff, the fact that they've chosen not to disclose it could affect people's clinical care, could affect their safety, could affect who is involved in being consulted by hospital staff on issues that are relevant when they're obtaining clinical information that perhaps the person themselves is not in a position to provide. And then talking about respect, Leon said, the system is designed to stop people improving. They decided what box you fit into. For me, that's scumbag, drug addict, thief. That's where they'll keep me. I'm not allowed to progress out of that box into a useful member of society. And in the full narrative, Leon really talks a lot about this. There were some situations where, for example, Leon was formerly incarcerated, and while incarcerated, there was a box that they check that stops people from receiving post about their healthcare. But years after Leon was no longer incarcerated, they actually hadn't removed that check. So Leon wasn't getting correspondence about his healthcare. So he was stuck into that box, and it just no one had identified, and he didn't identify what was going on. So again, this is more of that issue of the intricacy of systems and that disrespect actually feeding into from the larger macro level of disrespect at the systemic level, feeding into something as technical as a box being checked that then doesn't allow someone to receive correspondence about their own healthcare, which resulted in Leon missing appointments, which resulted in Leon not receiving documentation that he needed to actually get the care that was due to him. And talking also about respect, Rachel A said, anytime I mentioned any personal detail that she, meaning the GP, perceived as out of the ordinary, she would chuckle and say, you and partner's incorrect name are such an unusual couple. Initially, this was amusing, but it became less so as time went on, particularly when it was in response to decisions that I had made as an individual, for example, to travel extensively for work or to take up a new sport. So again, that issue of sort of ridiculing and trivializing other people's lived experiences and not feeding in an understanding of what their own lived experiences mean to them in the process of delivering healthcare. Now on the issue of information, Rachel A said, previously I saw the same GP for more than 10 years. Initially, she met my needs, but as my identities developed, the mismatch deepened, and I found that I wasn't able to honestly discuss my lifestyle and risk factors with her. I was dismayed at first that she seemed unable to remember my primary partner's name and often cautioned me to be sure that I stay focused on the relationship, so that he wouldn't have an affair or leave me for someone else. As a result, when my primary partner and I agreed to try polyamory, I felt unable to discuss issues such as STI testing with her. So here you can see that the lack of safety, the lack of respect results in people not feeling able to share necessary health-related information, to request necessary health information related to what their lifestyle and risk factors might be. And as a result, not receiving care. So there are barriers to that information sharing and that exchange happening. And again, you can see that all of these different healthcare rights intersect because safety and respect are part of setting the stage for being able to exchange information in a healthcare setting. In terms of partnership, Rachel B. said, "People don't understand why it's so hard for me to participate in projects like this, Intersections, or why the project process takes so long. I can only do everything that I can physically manage right now. As an autistic parent of an infant and a carer to my partner, I need to do this in person, in a quiet space, when I have very limited time and energy." So, and I think this was a useful quote too, because in the end, there were only 8 people who chose to share their experiences publicly, but we heard from a lot more people. And there were some people who had to drop out of the process, even with all of the accommodations that we made and all the changes and all the person-directed aspects of the project. And Rachel B., one of the things Rachel B. said in a number of the conversations we had is that she really wanted, when this was distributed to the public, she wanted people to be aware that people like her are very often excluded from projects like this, lived experience projects, because the logistical complexities involved meant that it actually took her months to put together various narratives that were relevant. And she has actually quite a very long and detailed and useful narrative that's available on the Health Consumers New South Wales website in the Intersections project section. In terms of privacy, Leo said about, in regards to their trans status, many medical services are different, and while most strive to be accepting, I've still had some really uncomfortable experiences. The one I get the most is because I've not yet legally changed my name. GPs will just read the legal name off the file and not the preferred name, and then walk out and announce my birth name to the entire waiting room. So this is an interesting thing, is a common way that the privacy of trans people is violated is when people go by a legal name or a Medicare record when they're communicating with people in front of other people. And I think that although this is a pretty straightforward violation of privacy and violates the Australian privacy principles as well as the healthcare rights principles, it's so common to do that people don't think about how that affects people and the safety issues that raises for people and how that can prevent people from even seeking healthcare services if they have to worry that might happen. So again, it's the fact that systems don't account for this issue by having separate boxes. So here's the name that we refer to you as, here's the pronouns we use for you, and separately, here's the information in your Medicare record when we're filing formal claims, especially if it's bulk billed. So there are lots of these kinds of issues that people encounter that, again, stop them from even showing up. And the system has an inadequate knowledge of that. So in terms of some of the recommendations, and again, I encourage people to read the actual report and look at the narratives on the website, because I think that there's a lot more sophistication and nuance there. But just to give you a few of the quick recommendations based on what we found, we recommend that health systems do a navigation audit, which is that you either get people with intersectional needs to be mock consumers of services, to go in through the health system and actually attempt to navigate it. And often this is a paid thing when people do this. And sometimes it's, if you can't get people with lived experience, which is strongly encouraged, even somebody going through and imagining I'm this person, if they have enough knowledge and familiarity, they might be able to do that. But it's always best to get people with lived experience. Again, nothing about us without us is for us. And you can do an audit of the whole system and identify these areas where logistically it's not working. Because I think a lot of assessments come as feedback on individual providers. What was your experience with this provider, but not on the system and how it actually works. We also promote feedback on health service review sites. It can be a really great place to find out information, especially if people don't feel comfortable telling you directly. They might go to a third-party site. And I think there's a few of those that Health Consumers New South Wales can recommend to people. Also, we want people to incentivize feedback on improving the system. That is, that there's people are usually deterred. There's a disincentive. But if people who are engaging with services and people who are providing services are actually incentivized, there's some benefits, they're rewarded, they're celebrated, they're appreciated for bringing things to the system's attention, and those examples are held up in a way that's publicized, that actually really supports and promotes people doing that. There's also a gap between talking to people providing care and the formal complaint, meaning that a lot of times people might tell the provider they're working with, but they don't want to file a formal complaint. And I think addressing that gap by providing some kind of interim measure can really be helpful. There's not as much patient advocacy available for people with intersectional needs. And another problem can be that when people are trying to file formal complaints, for example, trans people filing formal complaints may get misgendered in trying to make a phone call. So it's really important that that's taken into consideration. And autistic people also mentioned that they were having difficulty with formal complaint systems. Healthcare system design also needs to consider the impact of other systems on the health system. And this was a huge gap that was constantly identified. So in that comment from Leon earlier, there was the comment about how the different systems create barriers that are invisible. Thinking about how this impacts on health, other areas outside of health, what's happening with housing impacts health. What was happening with incarceration in the case of Leon was impacting his ability to receive correspondence from the health system. So these systems intersect, and it's really important to be aware of how that happens. Important when we're trying to create person-centered systems, avoid assumptions and value judgments, and really focus on the how, the process. That can be so much more important than the what. So there's really great aims and outcomes. But if the process is not trauma-informed, is not person-directed, is not culturally humble, then it won't really achieve those aims in a way that does more than just tick a box on KPIs. It won't actually address people's needs. And going back to that idea of incentivizing, one of the things that can be done is to appoint champions, to have some kind of rewards, and people get recognition at multiple levels when they challenge this computer says no culture. So if someone says, for example, well, there's nowhere to correctly put my pronouns or my gender or my name, people are very often being told the computer says no, I'm sorry, the system doesn't let me. And if people are able to make changes at the level of service delivery, or if there are champions that people can come to challenge that computer says no culture, then it can genuinely be a person-centered system rather than a system-centered system. Because at the moment, it's a system-centered system. It's not a person-centered one, despite that being used as kind of a buzzword in almost in many of the documentation that you find. And also we need to enable and encourage people who are providing direct services, and that includes reception and nursing staff, to make systemic changes where it's appropriate. So if you encounter that computer says no, somebody who's able to do something about that and then flag that for the system and then get some kind of encouragement or reward or incentive or recognition for having done so. So that's just a brief overview of the project. And I think what was interesting is that we barely skimmed the surface of what there is to know. And yet there's so much useful information that we got from people from their lived experience wisdom that really isn't part of how the system is currently designed, including in a lot of the co-design processes, because it's who's participating. It's people who have the emotional energy, the time to do that, who have the self-advocacy skills to do that. And I think that's something that a lot of the narratives we collected really share in common, is the fact that people hadn't been spoken to before. They didn't feel that they had been part of engagement processes. I wonder, Anthony, if you have anything to add before we open it up to questions and discussion.
One of the other groups that we really do need to acknowledge is colleagues from Southeastern Sydney Local Health District who supported the project and it was made possible with some financial support from CESLID that we really appreciate.
Yeah.
I think for us, what was some of the great learnings was, and again, every time we talk to consumers, we feel we know what people are going to say, and we always learn from that. But that the process that we used, and the slowing down the time frames and trying to make things as consumer directed as possible, even then we weren't able to reach everybody. And as Gávi said, there were people who started with us who, for whatever reason, weren't able to continue. So I think that was a really great lesson. We talk about people who are hard to reach, and really they're not hard to reach. It's hard for us to stop and take the time needed. And I think that was one of the great lessons that I got from this. And we're committed as an organisation to look at how and learn from this, and how we can incorporate the concept of intersectionality into our work going forward. One of the things about this discussion today was, one of the things that I think I've learned is that perhaps organising a webinar at a time when there's a lot of public holidays and things happening mightn't be such a great thing, because we've got such this intimate group that we're talking to. But the good thing about that is that we know that people who've got on board are interested. And one of the things, if people are interested, I'd invite people to turn their camera on, and perhaps we can have a short discussion, or if there are any questions or comments. We're a small group, so that will be quite easy to do, rather than have sort of take comments through the chat. And thanks, Tara, for mentioning Rainbow Connection in Sydney, Western Sydney. I think we'd certainly be able to work out a way to make sure they're aware of this work. Angela, hi, Ange.
I was interested in the pathway to influencing change from the work that you've done, because I particularly note your recommendations around system change. And given the way that health is structured in New South Wales, at least, it's quite a fragmented and distributed system.
Yeah.
So I suppose my question would be, where would you see the potential for starting to influence decision makers around maybe change?
Yeah, I think, and it's interesting because after we started this project, there were a number of different people that engaged us from different pockets of the system. So, I mean, the system, you're right, the system itself is not one system, right? And a big part of actually the insight from this project was, and I don't know if you were here for the comments from one of our participants, Leon, but these systems intersect in ways that it's often invisible to people providing services and not realizing the kinds of exclusions that get set up, some of which are intentional in the system design originally, and some of which are not. And so I think really thinking about your sphere of influence, I would say. So, for example, I'm a provider. I provide services. I'm also someone with intersectional needs who arguably would have been potentially someone who would be interviewed. But I'm also someone who has literacy privilege, who has formal educational privilege, despite all of the other things I have that areas of marginalization, I do have that educational privilege. I think given the spheres of influence, I would be looking at which groups are you part of? What about what happens in your own professional sphere? To what extent do you have the ability to do some sort of advocacy on a sort of lateral level, and then with the people that work with you, where you have some level of authority or some sphere of influence? And I think changing practices can be really important. Part of that is about language. Part of that is about technical details of what does it take from the time someone decides they want to work with you or the people you work with or who you're directly supporting or supervising. What does it take from the time that someone says, I want to receive that service, to actually getting it? What are all the systemic issues they might encounter going through that? And sometimes that people are more willing to tell you in conversation if they trust you than to fill out a little survey where they've got to put something down in writing. And that's particularly a cultural exclusion issue where there's this sort of, there's a sort of an Anglo-centric norm of everything being in writing and everything being on paper, where some people feel very uncomfortable doing that. And so, it's thinking about, like, for example, something like a meeting agenda. If you've got really specific timings for everything, then the dominant narrative will dominate because you've decided that this topic only gets 10 minutes. There isn't enough space, especially for someone who's been marginalized. There's going to be that self-policing and external policing of like who gets to address this issue. So you won't really actually even find out if there was a huge problem. So the idea of doing lots of things differently, from the way that meetings are planned and structured to what is the agenda, do you even have an agenda? Because the biggest thing a lot of people have said, and particularly when I've worked some of the communities that I'm part of culturally and otherwise, that people say, you know what, the whole way this was structured was problematic. It didn't meet my needs. So really asking those kinds of how questions. We talked a little bit about that. I don't know if you were there for that, but we talked about the how and not just the what. And not deciding what the outcomes are going to be, the KPIs, before you've even listened to the people that you're engaging with, because I think that happens a lot too. So I would say, Angela, if you want to follow up, I'm going to put my email in the chat, but I think it's something that Anthony and I, and certainly everyone at Health Consumers New South Wales, are really interested in providing support around. But I guess the big message is there are lots of things you can do to influence the system. You as one person can't completely change that system on your own, but it's certainly the case that one person can make a lot of difference. Even one interaction you have, one conversation you have, you don't know how that is going to feed out. And so just by you changing how you interact with the systems, you do make a bit of a difference. And the more you can get people on board to do things the way you do them, if you make these changes, you can kind of get a sort of community of practice of people who can support you in that work. It's very lonely to do it all on your own. I know that I've started a network of other practitioners just in psychotherapy communities, people from different professions who do psychotherapy, and where we talk about how do we challenge oppression. In fact, the group we have is called Honoring Diversity, Examining Privilege, and Challenging Oppression. We just call it HDEPCO for short. It's really funny. It's like, who needs more initialisms and acronyms in the world? But anyway, there are things you can do. So I don't know if that gives you some ideas. But sometimes it's as simple as, we have a monthly email and we send around stuff that's about intersectional needs. And, the other day we sent stuff on income inequality and how it affects therapy. And there's this myth among therapists that if you provide free therapy, people don't take it as seriously, which is such a self-serving conflict of interest kind of a belief. And yet it turns out that if you look at the research on social inequality and provided prejudices, that actually we get a very different story emerging, that if people discontinue services that are free, it's often because they felt so uncomfortable with the way the provider treated them and the way that they felt that they were being sort of given a charity or seen as a lesser person, or, it wasn't because they were like, oh, it's free, I don't care about it. So I think being aware of like what engagement you have. I mean, I don't know anything about your work and the specific scope of it, but I would imagine there are many different things that you might have the opportunity to do. I think sometimes there's this defeatist attitude among professionals where we're like, oh, but the system doesn't let me, but that's just how the computer's designed. Oh, but that's just what everyone does. It's like, that might be what everyone does, but we don't have to do it. Like, I will never use disorder labels in any of my correspondence. If I'm quoting someone themselves, I might use a disorder label, but I get around it. So I might talk about someone has a diagnostic label of, schizophrenia. Someone has a diagnostic label of, BPD. But I'm never going to use that language as me. I'm going to say they have a borderline relational style. They have lived experience of trauma. They have lived experience of substance dependency, and I'm always going to be really careful how I describe people. But it's not just the language. It's about how I even think about people and conceptualize them and their needs. And the idea that they are genuinely the experts on their lived experience. I just have specific skills around how to navigate difficult issues, some of which might be useful and some of which are totally useless. So it's like not thinking I have the solution just because some paper that didn't study someone with this complex set of intersectional needs, said, oh, well, these thousands of people that none of which represented this combination of demographic needs, said that, okay, well, here's what you do in this case, or here's what this person needs. I might find out if I talk to them that that's not at all what they need. You see that very often. So I guess it's introducing these ideas. And even if you just, like once a month, we send out a few resources to people. We send something by autistic people on, how to communicate respectfully with autistic people. Or we send something out about income inequality or about anti-racist practice. And it slowly trickles. The group's been going for several years. And now some of the practitioners are like, oh, I've started to change this and people are relating differently with me, but it's slow. So you can influence colleagues even just by sending them a link, to something, to a 5-minute video. So, and that's what those narratives on the Health Consumers New South Wales website are so great for, because you read these narratives, you digest them, something might occur to you that didn't occur to you before about, oh, well, maybe that relates to this situation that I had before. I didn't understand why this person was angry or why they never came back, or so you never know how much influence you're having, but I think just by doing anything, you do make a difference. So I guess that hopefully that's encouragement and support.
Yeah, no, it is. And I think the narratives that are on the website are really amazing. I think you've done some great work. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ange. And for people who don't know Ange, Ange is from Sydney Health Partners, wears many hats, but we've been working very closely with Ange for the past couple of years around involving consumers in research. And I'm sure now we'll be thinking with an intersectional lens on that as well.
It's just my thoughts were, I think what Gávi says about influencing is so important on so many levels. I'm mid-tier in my organisation, and but I have an opportunity because I've been around the tracks for a long time. I've got quite a lot of connections in different places. So I tend to influence up and down. And surprisingly, some of the influence goes as high up as the CEO in the end for things that matter. Because if you can be enthusiastic and you can get somebody in the tier above to share your enthusiasm, it can actually go all the way to the top. So I fully get the importance of influence, and it can and does work, even though we might feel that maybe the power imbalance may be there. Even as a more minor player, we actually can play a significant role.
Absolutely, Michelle, and I think that's one of the things. I know the examples that Gávi gave were a focus on the frontline staff and sort of trying to give more, looking at those power imbalances and allowing frontline staff to be more involved in some of the decisions and the design that affects people. But people in the middle, in middle management, we didn't mention explicitly, but I think your insights are spot on. It's sort of often overlooked from the outside, the importance of those sort of mid-management roles, because you are in that position to, as you say, influence not just the people below, but above through your own experience, professional and personal experiences that people bring. But also there's a lot to be said for enthusiasm. Having an enthusiastic, passionate colleague is, I think, one of the ways I've learned the most about anything. So I think they're really useful and helpful insights, Michelle.
Yeah, and I think the report does contain some suggestions for what you can do at that level. I think that was such an important point you made, because I think, and there is that power imbalance, right? When you're in that middle place where you're not actually the buck stops here authority, and then you might worry about pushback. I guess it's about relative influence, and I guess the thing you brought out is, think about who trusts you, who relies on you, whose ear do you have, so to speak, or whose sight do you have, depending if they don't have hearing, whose mind or whose being and consciousness is tuned toward you, regardless of, whether they're sighted or not, or whether they have hearing or not. And I think, that those kind of communications can be utterly transformative. In fact, like this whole project got started because I had a conversation with Anthony about a project that I did with some people in Scotland around intersectional needs. And I mean, that was like way long ago, if you remember that, Anthony. But we had that conversation, and Anthony, I think it was like way back when, I think I was even on Facebook at that point. And I think it was a Facebook post, and Anthony was like, oh, that's really interesting. He like responded to the Facebook post. That's really interesting. Let's talk about that. So just by me posting, I think it was I was posting the report from the other project. Anthony was like, oh, that's so interesting. Like, and it was the idea of, well, maybe we could do something like that here, adapted to an Australian context, because it was very much Scotland specific. And it was also very much about forcibly displaced people. So it had a heavy influence on looking at racism and culture in a way. It was grounded in existing work that was already being done on people seeking asylum. So I think you never know, like just a little Facebook post where I'm sharing this resource, and then Anthony got inspired and enthusiastic and took it from there.
Like knowing what you can influence, however modest that is, and sort of trying to make that happen. I mentioned the partnership with Ange, and again, that grew out of work Health Consumers New South Wales did sort of about 5 years ago. That was a workshop with another passionate supporter. And so building on, I think, that's starting modestly, starting with sort of passion and enthusiasm, and hopefully what we've done is giving people some resources and knowledge and sort of background to take it further. And we'll always be interested in having a conversation with you about other ways we can partner with you, your organisation, to help to help your organisation think about some of the recommendations and ideas in this report. And I don't know what that could look like, but let's have a conversation if people are interested. Just want to thank you all so much for coming. I hope you found it of interest. As I said, we've certainly learned something about timing when we put on webinars in the future, but we're so glad that you're able to join us today. So thanks to all the team at Health Consumers New South Wales. Thanks, Holly and Michelle, for sticking with us and being here. We're really so glad that you've been able to join us, and we'll see you all later. So thank you so much, and bye-bye.